Hello, welcome back. Glad to have you here again. This is Corey from New World Witchery. Probably know that. Today, I wanted to address something that has come up a couple of times with relation to um, the book, in terms of one of the things that I talk about in the book a little bit, and maybe some misconceptions that have kind of come out of that, as well as some things that maybe I could have framed a little better. And I'm going to take the chance to maybe try to do that a little bit in this video as well. One of the complaints that's come up a lot, squeaky chair. One of these complaints that's kind of come up a lot within the book being shared around, that I think people, mostly people, seem to kind of get, and they kind of work through this concept that I'm discussing in the book, but that I think has created a little bit of divisiveness, or a little bit of misconception, is this concept of the devil, right? There's this figure of the devil that I introduce and bring up in the book, talk about this figure for a few different reasons and in a few different ways. And I knew, even before the book was released, it had some early press copy that had gotten out there. And largely, people, again, responded very, very positively, understood kind of what I was talking about there. And I did have a few people who said, like, oh, there's a lot of devil talk in this book, or there's a lot of discussion of the devil. There's, in fact, an entire chapter that is devoted to this concept of the devil and witchcraft within the book. And it gets mentioned a few other times as well. And it's perfectly fair to say, like, oh, there's, a lot of devil mentions in this. If that's not what you were expecting in this book, I can see why that would be jarring and surprising. And by and large, again, most people seem to have kind of understood where I was going with it. But I've had a few people who've kind of reacted negatively to it. One person left a pretty negative Amazon review. I'm not going to call them out specifically by name here, because I don't want to dogpile on them. I'm a little surprised because their review winds up being the one, it's one of the top kind of upvoted reviews on Amazon. People have sort of, called it a helpful review over and over again, which means it's one of the first reviews people see. So even though it's very negative, and the book overwhelmingly has a very positive set of reviews on Amazon, it winds up being the first thing they see. That's just one of the funny things about kind of the way that the algorithm of all this works, or not, it's not even an algorithm, it's just sort of the way that Amazon's structure of the page works. But that's okay. But I wanted to kind of walk through something that this person had written, where they say this, the author's under a misconception. It's a damaging myth that all witches deal with the devil. The author is operating on the belief that a witch has to have an interaction with the devil, a deal with the devil, if you will. Many other books say different. I'm a witch, but I refuse to deal with the devil. Many witches don't even believe in the devil. This attitude was a real turnoff for me, so I'm actually returning this book, something I almost never do. And I'm sorry that they felt compelled to return the book. I would hope in a book this big, there would be other stuff that would be worth unpacking. But I get it. Sometimes you bump into something like that and you're like, well, this is not for me, right? This is absolutely not for me. And this book is definitely something where I can see that, it may not be for everybody. And that's perfectly fine as well. But I did want to kind of address some of this, and this is something I think they actually brought up on a separate social media account. I believe they kind of interacted with me there, and were saying, if it wasn't them, it was somebody that had basically the same idea, which is, why is there so much diabolism? Why is there this devil figure in this book, in this discussion of witchcraft, when we spent a lot of time in witchcraft, especially since the 1980s and 90s, which I'll kind of come back around to, very much kind of asserting there is no devil in the craft, right? It's the famous line of Practical Magic, like, oh no, there's no devil in the craft, right? Where she's defending that. And I get that. I get where people are coming from when they see that. And there's a very visceral reaction. There's some very negative stuff that comes in there. I did want to point out, in the chapter, the chapter that kind of talks about the devil kind of in the most detail, there are definitely these, this sort of recurring discussion about, for example, diabolical contracts as a part of folklore and things like that, which, again, I'll kind of come back to here in a minute. But there's this big whole chapter where I kind of talk about these different devil figures in folklore and folk witchcraft. one of the things that I do is I set aside a whole section where I say the devil's trick. Does the devil belong in witchcraft? And I'm going to read from the book here just because I want to make sure that I'm stating this kind of clearly. So I say, so what's the point of getting tangled up with the devil in the first place? After all, a number of witches practicing under the fold of neo-pagan practices have actively spent decades trying to combat the perception of their religion as anything diabolical. Why bring him into anything at all? Isn't that just courting disaster? Yes and no. The devil is a part of witchcraft lore, just as spells and moonlit dances and broomsticks are. But witches don't always have to have broomsticks or dance in the moonlight. Some people call themselves witches and say stay far away from spells, preferring the label to be a religious one. There are a lot of ways to be a witch, and doing work with any sort of devil is just one potential option among many. Devils are tricksy creatures, and they do offer us some wonderful gifts to a practicing witch, including spiritual aids, such as imps and familiars found in lore, or even the guidance on spell creation and ingredients. They can add tremendous amounts of power to other workings, and Sabbath rites can become truly otherworldly when a devilish figure joins in. And I say this having experienced this several times, both on my own and with others. More crucially, when we fear the devil, we let him become our master. If you pay attention to the stories, the devil is really a threat to those who don't know how to manage him, those who rely on the intervention of other spiritual forces like angels or God to stave off his wiles. Those who do know how to deal with him often gain his instruction, his gifts, and even occasionally his favor by outwitting him. Cunning is an essential part of witchcraft. It requires thinking flexibly on the fly, crafting solutions that others cannot think of, a sort of lateral problem-solving skill that sees the unseen mechanics of an enchanted world and uses them wisely and well. That is the devil witches meet, the one they can outsmart, because that's essentially why he's there. Couple things to kind of unpack there. One, I very much want to reiterate, if you're a witch and you don't work with the devil, that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's fairly normal. Nowadays, it's incredibly normal not to have any kind of traffic with the devil or anything that would be sort of labeled as diabolical. Very reasonable, very normal for that to be the case. And I feel like, maybe I didn't make that clear enough within the book, and I should have perhaps put that in sooner within the introduction, even sort of framing that up so people understood that this figure is not a figure that everyone has to work with, or even that I'm recommending working with him for everybody. I think you have to have a certain kind of mindset about it, and you have to have a certain kind of approach to it. But that this is not something that everybody has to do or everybody should be doing. This is a figure that appears in folklore, and in doing so offers a few different kind of ways to sort of think about magic through his appearance. So why is he a problem at all to begin with? One, there is this history. There's absolutely this history with the devil as a figure sort of presented, particularly by church sources. And here I'm talking about the Christian church because that's what I'm most familiar with. But, going back, if you kind of root back into some of the kind of the early days of, thinking about kind of early Christianity and kind of the sort of the origin stories of some of that material, they're drawing on a few concepts from sort of Judaism that existed before, but they're also incorporating a lot of other things. So, for example, very much this sort of Zoroastrian perception of good versus evil and sort of absolute dualism, whereas the ancient, Roman pagan world and even the ancient sort of Hebrew world, there was a recognition of good and harm in the world, but there was a lot more subtlety, a lot more shades of gray kind of playing out in those kind of ancient texts. And you actually see early on in the development of Christianity, there's this phenomenon where initially the Roman society around Christianity reacts negatively to it, throwing them to the lions kind of stuff, because they're accusing them of doing all these kind of really bizarre, very occult sounding things, things that border on these sort of diabolical rites, things like cannibalism, right? They're eating flesh and blood and things like that, holding these kind of secret meetings or secret underground rites. They're violating social taboos by having people of different classes mix in different ways. And then they're engaging in what to that society would have seemed like strange sexual practices, because a number of them were practicing things like abstinence. You had some early church members who would do things like self-castration. There's a fellow named Origen, I think Oregen, but maybe Origen. I had to look that one up. Who self-castrated and actually got in trouble for that, because they said, no, that's not what we mean by being celibate. But all these kind of figures are sort of treated by Roman society as this weird occult force that threatens to destabilize what they understand. Nero very much tries to blame the Christians for some things during his era. But then as Christians kind of gain power towards the third, fourth, fifth centuries, they begin flipping this idea around, and they start saying, no, look, there are people who are serving this sort of absolute evil and doing these things that you've been accusing us of, but it's not us, it's these other people. By and large, the people they're talking about are Jews. They're throwing these accusations at Jewish people because they want to present them as the wrong side of history, right? The wrong side of the sort of theological argument that they're making. There's a really great, if you haven't found the Jew Witches podcast yet, I highly recommend it. Zoe over there does this really, really great breakdown of this historical overlap between the persecution of Jews and the persecution of witches, because they do basically blend together. These accusations they're making against Jews in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries become the same kind of accusations that you see moving into the Middle Ages, where they start saying witches are engaging in acts of cannibalism and blood drinking. They're meeting with these kind of evil forces, including the devil, which is an accusation they make against the Jews as well. So that's kind of going on. You also have this notion that the devil is in this kind of constant lockstep mythological battle with sort of Christian forces. You see that play out during the creation of stories like Paradise Lost by Milton, during essentially the Reformation era, right? So all of this stuff is kind of feeding into these concepts about, diabolism and witchcraft, and people within the church hierarchy, within the church official structure. And it's very important to make that differentiation. People who are members of the official church body, both Protestant and Catholic, are looking for people to kind of blame for the problems that are going on around them. And in a lot of cases, if you don't have somebody to specifically pin it on, you're going to pin it on somebody in league with evil forces, right? So if you've lost power because your ideas are no longer standing up to scrutiny, then you may be inclined to sort of flip that around and say, like, oh no, it's not that we were wrong, it's that there is now this new evil presence that has come in and started disrupting our world, right? And that's the church trying to exercise a certain amount of control. And it's also, even at the local level, priests needed something to be able to fight against. So they would sort of say, well, it must be diabolical witchcraft. So if somebody's doing fortune telling, for example, it's easier to say, well, that's diabolical, and the only way that you can really receive revelations are by consulting with a priest, or through dreams, direct intercession from God, which a priest will then help you interpret in some way, shape, or form. So that kind of stuff begins to really shape this interaction with this figure of the quote-unquote devil, and how they're creating this sort of dualistic theology that's constantly sort of fighting. And we see that even play out moving into the more contemporary era. This is the Satanic Panic. This is very much what people are talking about when they talk about this fight between witchcraft as a sort of nature-based, magical, spiritual worldview, and then the sort of way it's been presented by, for example, the Christian church or various Christian churches and things like that. The Satanic Panic, which if you get a chance to ever read Bill Ellis's work on that, he's a folklorist who did some phenomenal work. And we have a good episode where we talk to some people who were involved with this Satanic Panic and kind of break down some of those things that were happening at the time. But if you kind of unpack all that, you see that there were actually Christian churches fighting with each other, and they couldn't figure out why they were fighting with each other if they were all supposed to be on the same page. And so in the end, they basically looked around and said, well, there's a growing interest in this kind of mystery occultism stuff. Maybe that's the devil jumping in and doing some things. Great, let's run with that. And so that becomes kind of the motivating force of the Satanic Panic in a lot of ways, as it moves from the 50s into the 60s, and then finally into the 70s and 80s, where it really takes concrete form. And I'm not going to break down the whole history of the Satanic Panic right here, because there's so much to go into there. But I do want you to understand that, yes, there are these historical forces kind of shaping the understanding of diabolism and Satanism and things like this, that the church, the official church, is kind of saying are out there. This devil that's out for the ruin and destruction of souls, if you know the St. Michael prayer, right? And so there's that version that's out there. And that's something that can be attached to anything that they don't like, including some of these kind of folk practices that are going on. Now, in conjunction with that, there also happen to be a lot of stories about these weird figures coming out of folklore. So, for example, if you're in kind of a German area, you might have something called der Teufel, which is basically the devil, but comes out of this kind of wild man tradition of folklore, where you have these kind of wild men that live out in the woods, or that live in swamps or bogs, or maybe even underground, and they're considered to be dangerous, but they're also kind of appealing. Sometimes they may have some secret treasure or secret knowledge. If you've read The Devil's Grandmother in the Grimm's collection, I think it actually is called The Three Golden Hairs, but it's the devil and his grandmother. The grandmother doesn't. Where does she come from in Christian theology? She doesn't exist, right? That's what we know of from Christian theology. So this devil and the devil's grandmother, these are folk figures that have been essentially invented as a part of local mythology, local folklore. You also have a ton of folklore, both from the old world and the new, where they talk about these kind of trickster devil figures, right? If you know the story of Jack O'Lantern, right, which derives from Irish. There's some English versions of it. You find them over here in Appalachia, the Jack Tales. The idea that the devil shows up, wants this one sinner's soul, quote unquote sinner's soul, and he's gonna make him come to hell with him. But this guy outsmarts him, gets the devil to turn himself into a coin so he can pay for their drinks, and then puts him in his pocket next to a cross or something like that, to keep the devil sort of stymied until he releases them. Eventually, he's too evil to go to heaven. The devil doesn't want him in hell because he's smarter than the devil is, and so he's doomed to wander the earth, right, carrying this lantern. Which becomes the jack-o'-lantern that we know at Halloween, right? You also have stories like Molly Horn in Maryland. She is a woman who seems to be engaging some magical combat with the devil, creating some of the sort of land features around there. There's like a hole, like not quite a harbor, but sort of a sinkhole, a water-filled sinkhole there, that she supposedly caused when she got into this sort of magical combat with the devil. You have stories in the American South about the devil kind of jumping out from behind a rock. There's a tradition of shouting Christmas gift to get somebody to give you a present during the Christmas holidays and things like that. And so the devil would sort of surprise God and say Christmas gift, and so God would give him the worst piece of land he had around. So in some cases, this winds up being Florida or West Texas or something like that. That is sort of the devil's land because it's just the worst piece of land that God can give away. You also have, for example, the Man in Black, right? This shows up in a lot of African American folklore, although found in folklore beyond that as well, of meeting someone at the crossroads. And importantly, sometimes he's called the Man in Black. Sometimes he's called the Black Rider. There's a couple of different iterations of him, but he is also called the devil. And this is really, really important. Local terminology is going to change and be different depending on who you're talking to. Doesn't mean that any one person's name for him is wrong. It just means that there's different local terminology. And some people are looking at it from the outside and saying, oh, don't mess with that. That's the devil. And some people are saying like, oh, that's a devil, right? And there's some differences there. There's some subtleties, right? I've got over here, I've got Krampus right there behind me, right? That's a kind of localized version of this sort of devil figure that features in local folklore, right? It's not the the arch nemesis of God. Even when you are dealing with Krampus, in the European context, this Krampus figure is kind of maybe kept on chains by Saint Nicholas or by another saint. Um, but he's not the devil kept forever in chains. It's a kind of local version of that devil that's being kept in chains. You've got a ton of different stories that have to do with sort of meeting with the devil and either learning from him or tricking him in some way, shape, or form. And you do have some stories. You do have some stories where the devil is offering you something that you want as well. So if you've seen, for example, I think it's the Robert Eggers film 2015 or 2016, The Witch. At the very end, there's the famous thing where he says, "Oh, dost thou like the taste of butter? Wouldst thou like a pretty dress?" Right. So he's offering this girl whose family has been destroyed by both their own mistakes and to some extent the sort of outside occult presence in their life. Um, he's offering sort of the last member of this family the opportunity to kind of come and be a part of his witch's coven, so to speak, and give her what she wants. But it's important to remember that he is offering something. Most of these kind of interactions with the devil in folklore are very transactional. They're very much about interacting with this spirit. For example, the man at the crossroads, right? Bringing your guitar, letting him take your guitar from you for a minute, tune it up. Maybe he'll trim your nails in some folklore and stuff like that. And then you gain something from that. Suddenly you're able to play guitar better than anyone else around, right? And the devil went down to Georgia, right? The Charlie Daniels song. That is not in and of itself local folklore, but it derives from kind of some folklore imagery that's in there. And he's offering a fiddle of gold for somebody who can beat him in this contest, right? These are contests with the devil. They're meetings with the devil that are supposed to offer someone a chance to challenge themselves, right? So in my book, I talk about this idea of don't let fear become your master. If you fear the devil and you treat him with sort of a fearful response, then it's very easy to sort of lose your way with that, or to keep that at arm's length and want to say, oh, it doesn't exist. Oh, it doesn't exist. It's not a thing that I do. And it's fine for you not to have anything to do with it, but you shouldn't do it from a place of fear, because when you're afraid of that figure, then it can outwit you, can outsmart you. And the whole point of that figure in folklore seems to be very much about you outsmarting him. It seems to be very much about you writing the terms of your own contract. That's one of the exercises I get into in the book. Is you sit down and write the terms of your own contract, that where you say, this is what I want, and this is what I'm willing to kind of offer in return. This isn't necessarily a worship relationship either, like you would see in a sort of Christian church. These are transactional interactions. These are your work with a spirit, in this case, a trickster type spirit, that may be able to teach you something because he's been able to interact with a lot of other people throughout history, right? Or he may be able to give you something, some tool or some ability that you don't currently have. And importantly, he's your test. He's your way of saying, like, okay, I am going to go and kind of face down this particular form, this particular spirit. I'm going to meet this particular entity, and I'm going to see if I can overcome that, right? See if I can beat that. There are risks. Witchcraft has risks. It's just how it appears in folklore. There are risks in witchcraft. But that being said, the rewards on the other side of that, if you're willing to face those down, then you're going to potentially gain a lot more from them. If you think about this in terms of the Crossroads Deal, right? The Crossroads Deal in a lot of American folklore has to do with you're being willing to repeatedly show up at that crossroads, despite getting a lot of scary things kind of showing up first. So the first time you show up, there may be like a black rooster or a black bird that sort of makes you feel a little uneasy. Then it might be a black dog. Well, a dog might be a little bit dangerous. Next time, it might be a slightly larger black animal. Maybe it's a bobcat or something like that. It's getting wilder and wilder, stranger and stranger creatures. Black cats might show up. You might see a bear, for example, a black bear while you're at the crossroads. There's somebody, if you listen to the Invoking Witchcraft podcast, Archaic Honey, Britton Boyd on that, they talk about their experience with this and how it was a black Cadillac, I think, that kind of pulled up one night. And that's very intimidating, very scary. But you sort of stand your ground with that. You sort of stick through that as a sort of test of your own mettle, right? A test of your own fear. And in doing that, you potentially have the ability to prove to yourself that you're ready for that next layer or level of witchcraft or whatever skill it is that you're trying to attain. But you also show that you're not going to be pushed around by the spiritual world either, right? You are, if not in command, you are in possession of your own self and your own sense of assuredness. That's a very powerful thing to have, to be able to say, like, I control my own self and my own destiny, my own fate, through magic or through whatever method I have. And that's really what I hope people, when they see the devil in this book or in these kind of discussions of folk witchcraft, when you're going out to a crossroads or to a graveyard or wherever it is that you're going to go to interact with these spirits, that interaction should be done not from a place of fear, but from a place of strength, right? That you should feel strong enough to do that. That doesn't mean you can't feel a little afraid or that you can't have nerves about something, but you don't let it master you. You don't let it tell you, nope, I'm going to run. I'm going to, first, there's a crow at the crossroads. Whoosh, I'm out of there, right? And I speak from experience there. I've had experiences where I got scared and I ran in those situations, and I regret that. I would go back and I would do that again differently if I could, and I have gone back and experienced things a little differently at various times. But that's the whole thing: is that this devil figure that appears in folklore, it is not this big sort of al-Shaitan, Satan figure. Most of the time, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a very kind of localized manifestation of something a little weird, a little tricksy, a little dangerous, but something that is there to help you prove your power to yourself and potentially gain something from that experience. And again, if you're a witch and you don't want to engage with that particular spirit, that's fine. To me, what defines a witch is somebody who's working magic and who has some kind of a relationship with the spiritual realm. And I know that can vary a lot. And for some people, it's the spiritual realm is basically the psychological realm. That's fine too. But what you do see is this: you're doing magic, and you have some kind of traffic with the spiritual world. But that doesn't mean that you have traffic with every particular spirit that everybody else has traffic with, right? You don't work with the devil, that's fine. It doesn't impact your practice negatively to do that. But you shouldn't necessarily be afraid of the presence of the devil in folklore either, right? You should be able to read that and not immediately get your hackles up and feel like, the only thing that they could possibly be talking about is the sort of church persecution of people. That's there. It's certainly something to explore. You shouldn't ignore that part of history either. But you should also be able to recognize that the folklore is telling you something about a different kind of creature. This is not the same kind of creature that you would necessarily find, in the official church doctrine, right? Like these are very localized stories telling you about very localized kind of spiritual beings. And again, if you don't work with the devil, that's your choice. There's so many ways to be a witch. None of them have to be the same. There's a great witch's proverb that sort of says, 4 witches, 5 opinions, right? Or 12 witches gathered around the fire, 13 at the meeting, or something to that effect. And the idea is, one, that a group of witches is more than the sum of their individuals, but two, that we often are very divided. We have a lot of different opinions about things, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that that any one person's practices is entirely wrong, right? But it's important, I think, for me, that people understand that this figure is there. It's available to be worked with. There are some benefits to interacting with it. More importantly, there's a lot of benefits to understanding the folklore of this figure, because it's so prevalent across so many cultures and so many different versions of witchcraft lore. So hopefully this video has helped you to kind of see that position in a different light. Again, I'm not advocating that people go out and work with this figure unless that's what you want to do. But I don't want people to be afraid of this figure either. I want people to walk away from this and say, okay, I get what this is talking about now. And I wish I had done a better job of that in the book. I wish I had been a little clearer in my explanations there, especially early on, just to kind of get that out of the way. But it's okay. That's part of this process, is that we get to then have this kind of conversation. If you either work with a figure like this, if you have local folklore about a devil figure, I would love to hear that. Please do share that in the comments. If you don't work with this figure, that's great too. I'd love to kind of hear how do you see this figure kind of fitting into the folklore more generally as well. And just kind of sharing your ideas too. So please feel free to leave those in the comments. I will have links to some resources and things like that that might be valuable to you in the show notes, including our episode on the Satanic Panic, so you can kind of hear the history of that. Because there are real and legitimate worries and fears about being seen as associated with the devil in kind of the popular mindset. So I totally get when people are like, no, that's not my thing, because I don't want to be associated with that in front of other people. I get that. So that's perfectly reasonable. And Satanic Panic is a really good kind of proof of why that can go very, very badly too. So all that being said, I hope this was informative or interesting to some of you out there, and that you will come back again and share your ideas with me about some of these things. Let me know kind of some things that you would like me to talk about too. Let me know what topics you'd like me to visit and cover as well. If there's other stuff in the book that I should get into, I'd love to do that too. Just let me know what you're interested in. But until next time, thanks for watching.